Close your eyes and imagine. What if the things in life that cause us the greatest pain, the things that bring us grief, are challenges? Challenges designed to help us grow, to ultimately become what we were always meant to be. We feel like we've been buried, but what if, like a seed, we've been planted? And having been planted, we grow to become a mighty tree. Now, open your eyes. Open your eyes to this way of viewing life. Come with me as we explore your true, infinite, eternal nature. This is Grief to Growth, and I am your host, Brian Smith. Hey everybody, this is Brian Smith back with another episode of Grief to Growth, and today I've got with me a fellow Shining Light parent. Her name is Michele Benyo. And Michele is a certified grief recovery specialist. She's a parent mentor. She's a founder of Good Grief Parenting, and that's what we're going to talk about mainly today. And Good Grief Parenting's purpose is to support parents who are raising young bereaved siblings after child loss. Her mission is to be a voice for the youngest of grievers and to help parents nurture and understand the unique needs of children who have lost a sibling in early childhood. When Michele's 6-year-old son David died of cancer, her daughter Deanna said, "Mommy, half of me is gone." Deanna was just 3.5 years old. And even though Michele was teaching early childhood parenting classes and had a master's in early childhood education, she didn't know how to best help her daughter. This inspired her to become the support she had needed. This inspired her to become the support she had needed most during that time so that parents like her wouldn't have to work to go it alone. She spent more than 20 years learning all she can about early childhood sibling loss, its lifelong impact on the surviving sibling, and how parents can help their bereaved children grow up whole and happy. Michele equips parents with tools to help their family heal after child loss, to foster hope, and to build resilience. Parents who work with Michele tap into their own wisdom and gain the insights, skills, and confidence to live forward toward a future bright with possibilities and joy. When she's not helping parents, Michele enjoys adventures with her daughter, dinner with friends, seeking out keto recipes to satisfy her sweet tooth, and hiking the woods and lake country of beautiful Minnesota. So with that, I'd like to welcome to Grief to Growth, Michele Benyo.
Thank you, Brian. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you, and I have to say that, and I was telling you before we got on the air, I work with a
hmm
lot of grieving parents, and one of the questions I get asked most often is, how do I handle the surviving child? We
hmm
a lot of times that surviving child gets kind of overlooked. We don't know how to handle early childhood, that kind of thing, and it's a
hmm
huge impact on that child, as you said in your bio, for the rest of their life. So,
hmm
tell me about David. I always give people a chance to talk about their kids. So, tell me
hmm
about David, and tell me about how you get started with Good Grief Parenting.
Okay. Well, I was an early childhood parent educator when I had David. I was in my mid 30s. And so I had lived a lot of good life, had a lot of good roles, and learned about being an early childhood parent educator when I became a mom. And he was my first child. And that I thought that would be just a great thing to do. So I went back and got my license and my master's and started working with families who had young children like mine. I had David first and then Deanna,
Mm-hmm.
and was a parent educator working with these families when, at the age of 4.5, David was diagnosed with cancer. And the interesting thing was that in getting my degree at the university, I'd encountered from one of my professors, Ted Bowman, his information about loss of dreams for families.
Mm-hmm.
And it had really touched me as someone who was getting trained to work with families. And I thought, I just really want to help families have dreams when they've lost their dreams. And little did I know that just really less than a year later, I would be challenged with that myself. And so David went through 2.5 years of cancer treatment. Deanna was 15 months old when her brother was diagnosed.
Mm-hmm.
And so she went through the 2s and 3s, and we all know about the 2s and 3s. They're called the terrible 2s. And she went through that phase when her brother was in the hospital and we were in and out of the hospital. And she was as good as gold. She toilet trained herself because I just couldn't focus on that task.
Mm-hmm.
And she never was a terrible 2 or a terrible 3. But it was a tough journey for all of us. And we decided early, my daughter, as the bio indicates, was really my teacher in this journey, not only because of what she said at 3.5, but because of what she did the first night her brother was in the hospital. We were home alone and Dad and David were in the hospital. She was 15 months old. And she wandered around the house just wailing, just making this inhuman sound that I had never heard anyone before or since make. And she was inconsolable. I would go and try to comfort her and she'd push me away and throw herself on the ground. Mm-hmm. So at that very young age, she showed me that young children really do feel a family's trauma. They really do grieve. And we said, when we are in this journey and our son's in the hospital, there is no way that there are going to be 3 of us in one place and one of us home in the cul-de-sac with neighbors. So she was with us for that journey. And it was one of the best decisions I think we ever made. And so when our son died and she said that to me, that was when the whole idea of good grief parenting came to me, because of course we don't want that for our child. Losing my son was the most devastating thing I've ever experienced. But the worst part of it was his little sister losing half of herself in the process and having to live the rest of her life without her brother, with half of her being gone.
Yeah, that's it's incredible that that connection she felt with David even at
Yes.
15 months.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I would say, she's a precocious, perceptive, articulate little bunny. She was she's 25 now. That was 21 years ago that I experienced this. And I thought, okay, I'm in this profession. I'm in this field. If there are resources to be found, I'm going to find them. I'm going to figure out how to help her grow up whole and happy. But, Brian, I didn't find those resources. They weren't out there. We didn't have the internet resources that we have now. We didn't have many of the books that have been written now. And so I realized that I would have to do this myself. And as the educator in this in this phase of life with young children of the early childhood age, and parents not like me, not knowing what to do with this, I knew that someday I would have to be that support that I needed. Even back then, I thought, okay, if I can't find the resources, nobody else can, and I'm going to have to provide this. What I didn't realize was that it was going to take me 18, 19 years to feel like I could really offer this to other parents, because there's so much to navigate, which I don't think most people really understand or realize. There's so much to navigate to raise that child from 3.5 to adulthood as a bereaved sibling, and me as a bereaved parent.
Yeah, absolutely. There is so much to navigate. So how is grief different in children than it is for adults?
One of the things that I think adults, once upon a time, and not all that long ago, we really didn't give really young children credit for grieving, because they couldn't verbalize, and most of them don't express what my daughter did. And we know that they don't understand death and some of those concepts. And we don't recognize how quickly and deeply they can be attached, and that just like anybody else, they're going to feel the absence. And so we don't recognize many of the behaviors that a grieving child might do as grief because we think that it's just age appropriate behavior or it's just development. And as kids get to be, a little bit older, like 3.5, 4, we're going to see them doing a lot of playing, and we're not going to see them necessarily. I mean, even after my daughter said, "Mommy, half of me is gone," she didn't grieve the way I did. She didn't cry a lot.
Mm-hmm.
She was playing by herself a lot. And if I tuned in, I could hear that she was playing. David was always there. She was sometimes singing about missing her brother, but she didn't seem like she didn't seem, to use, for lack of a better word, broken the way that I did in the way that she behaved. And often parents will say, well, my child seems to be doing well, so I think they're doing okay. And I can pretty much guarantee you that they're probably not. Inside, they're confused. They may be even scared. Deanna continued to be so good. And we would say to her, "Honey, you don't have to always be good. It's okay for you to be mad," because she was so good. She didn't want to upset me. She didn't want to upset her dad. She didn't want to rock the boat. She didn't want to cause any problems. And so children sometimes grieve by being very good, by kind of fading into the background, not wanting to rock the boat. Sometimes they may grieve by reverting to behaviors we thought we'd gotten over with them. A child may become whinier or clingier. Sometimes they become more boisterous and aggressive and irritable, and they end up getting disciplined because these young kids are needing to learn boundaries. And so we mistakenly believe as adults that that they're just kind of doing age appropriate behavior, and we need to reinforce boundaries. And so, and sometimes they may even exhibit physical behaviors. One parent shared with me a story of a sibling that was having the stomach aches and just unable to sleep. And she wondered if it was grief. And she asked the pediatrician, and the pediatrician said, well, the sibling died 6 months ago. The child should be over it by now. And I thought, how awful that the pediatrician didn't recognize that those kinds of symptoms too can be grief in this little one's body, and that it can last for a long time. So their grief is very often not recognized as grief.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious. I know that Deanna was very young when David died. We're going to talk about the died word too, because I don't use that word.
Yes.
But Deanna was very young. Have you studied how does it affect older children, like teenagers? Because I find a lot of parents, it's like we end up with teenagers and young adults that are going through it. So how is that different than with younger children?
Well, my area of expertise really is the early childhood age, around all of the importance of that identity piece and that development that happens in those formative years. I have, though, tried to read just about every book that's been written about sibling loss. And there are certainly some things that are similar. And it is that piece that a child may not be verbal about it. They may become moodier. Again, I would just encourage someone with an older child to look at their behavior. Are they starting to, be more withdrawn? Are they starting to be more irritable? Are they just much more quiet? Have they lost interest in the things that they used to find interest in? Kids don't typically talk about it. And one of the main pieces of advice I would give a parent of any age, and this is hard for us as parents, is to open up and invite the conversation with the child that has had this loss. Because if we don't open up the conversation, we can't expect them to have it with us.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes with older kids, especially, I think we may open up the conversation and they may not want to talk about it. That can be really hard for us because we're trying to help them, but they don't seem helped. But the main thing is for them to know that they can talk to us when they're ready, not to force them to talk, because
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't help, but just being a parent that can say the loved one's name, that can share memories, that can not allow the elephant to grow in the room. Because if we don't talk about the loss, because we don't want to upset the child, we're just going to create a space that isn't safe to talk, and where that elephant just gets bigger and bigger. So that I would say is true of a child of any age, is that they need opportunities to talk and to pay attention to their behavior that that may not be typical, and just let them know, share with them how you're feeling,
Mm-hmm.
so that, if you don't want to ask them how they're feeling because they're not necessarily going to want to talk to you about that, you can say, this is how I'm feeling. Do you ever feel that way? Or, what do you miss the most about so and so?
Mm-hmm.
Ask them some questions that maybe they can answer, that will tune you into what they're feeling. So
Yeah, great.
those would be some suggestions.
That's good to hear because that's what I've
Mm-hmm.
been telling people. So it's good to know.
Mm-hmm.
I've been telling,
Yes, absolutely.
in my experience, my daughter was, Kayla was 18 when Shayna passed, and Shayna was,
Mm-hmm.
15 and a half.
Yeah. Oh,
So,
so
I
hard.
find it, and I find when I talk to a lot of other parents, it's the same. It's like, I love what you said earlier. It's like sometimes I think we want to tell ourselves they're doing okay because they don't bring it up. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's very
Mm-hmm.
common that the kids won't bring it up, but that doesn't mean they don't have the feelings. Sometimes they don't want to trigger us. Sometimes
Exactly.
they're afraid to be vulnerable. They don't want to cry in front of us.
Mm-hmm.
So what I've done with my daughter is just try to do it by example. Just to
Yes.
keep talking about Shayna and expressing how I feel, and giving her that opportunity, to come around when she's ready. So
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate
How
that.
does she seem to be responding to that? Does she talk with you, or is she?
Yeah, she does. She does. It's been almost, it's been 6.5 years now. So
Mm-hmm.
she's 20. She'll be 25 in a couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we have a really good open thing. We talk about Shayna. We included her. So like when we were making the arrangements, we said, what do you want? What do you think Shayna would want? Putting up pictures of Shayna in the house. We asked, even though she wasn't living in the house at the time, how do you feel about this? So we just, and she told us like certain things,
Perfect.
like we were talking about, we did have Shayna's body cremated. And so we talked about getting an urn. She said, "No, no ashes in the house. It's creepy." So we said, "Okay."
Mm-hmm.
So we
Mm-hmm.
won't put an urn in the house. So we let her be,
Okay.
involved in that.
Yeah. Oh, that's really wonderful. And that is just such a way of helping them face the grief and grow with the grief. And, she will, as Deanna's 25 now. And
Hmm.
of course, I've seen her through so many ages.
Yeah.
I saw her become her brother's age, and how that kind of, made her think about, am I going to die now? I
Hmm.
saw her go off to school and actually find some comfort in that. She asked me when she went to first grade, if David were alive, what grade would he be in? And I said he'd be in fourth grade. And she
Hmm.
said, oh, good, then he'd be in my school. And she took a lot of comfort from that. But it's like, he's not here. But yet thinking that he would be in her school with her gave her some comfort. So, and I've just seen her through so many um, places where those secondary losses just kind of rear their ugly heads. The
Hmm.
year that he would have graduated from high school, and some of her friends' siblings were graduating from high school,
Hmm.
and her brother wasn't there. She drew a picture of him in his cap and gown and actually made him the valedictorian of his class.
Oh wow.
And so that's the other thing about children, whatever age they are, they're going to encounter times in their lives where the absence of their sibling is just so profound. Some of David's classmates had pictures of him. One of them had a Pokemon table with his picture at their graduation party.
Hmm.
And his cousin, my sister's daughter, had a picture of him at her wedding. And Deanna probably, Deanna will too, I'm sure. And so, yes, and with your daughter too, there will be times when we'll just need to have conversations about how they're feeling now in this new part of their life, and being able to have that foundation of conversation so that can continue when it needs to is just so important.
Yeah, as you're saying, I was just kind of smiling, and I think it's going to be so comforting to a lot of parents because one of the big fears we have when our children pass is everybody's going to forget them. And
Yes.
and for David to have been 6 years old in the past 20 years ago, I
Hmm.
was I was wondering if Deanna would even remember much
Hmm.
about him. So
She
I
doesn't.
Yeah, but she still includes him in her
Hmm.
life. Yeah.
Hmm. It really is hard for her that she doesn't have her own memories. She,
Okay.
she knows the stories, she sees the pictures, but she doesn't feel like she actually remembers him. And we live next door to a family of four, where one of the boys was David's age and his friend. And so that boy next door can actually remembers David, and she doesn't actually remember him, and that's very hard for her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that makes it even more interesting that
Hmm.
she keeps him included in her life, and,
Right.
and and I know as a parent, again, that's a big fear that we have.
Hmm. Hmm.
Some parents, we feel like we're going to forget our kids, and
Hmm.
other people aren't going to say their names. So hearing that David is still part of your family and still part of your traditions, and my nephew got married a couple of years ago, and the kids all wore pictures of Shayna, like the guys under their
Oh,
ties and the girls under the
yes.
hem of their dresses, and it was so comforting to us that Shane was part of that, and it had been at least 4 years since she had passed.
Yes. Well, and that speaks to how you remembered Shayna, because sometimes, and I think especially for young children, I also talk to parents who have had a stillborn child,
Hmm.
or have had a late term miscarriage. And, families sometimes get advice about what to do or not to do that keeps that child present. And certainly, with, you said your daughter who died was 15.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yes. And, with a child that's had been out in the world, had friends, done things, been known, it's one thing. But even so, sometimes people um, feel like others expect them to sort of leave this person behind. Good old Freud's idea of grief was to close that door, to end that relationship and move on. And some
Hmm.
people still kind of um, indicate that maybe that's what we should do. But one of the other things that I think is so important for parents and families to recognize is the importance and healing impact of those, what we call continuing bonds. Are you
Hmm.
familiar with the continuing bonds idea of
Uh,
grief?
yes, yes, absolutely.
And
Yeah.
it's so important. And I'm so glad that this has come front and center as a healthy way to grieve, because it wasn't that long ago that people were discouraged from that. And
Right.
so that willingness to speak their name, to include, to include them, maybe have some holiday traditions or celebrations where they are a part of it, and just to share the memories and let other people in in our children's lives and our lives know that we want to keep that presence with us. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because I work with people that are experts in grief, and I work with her name is Dr. Terry Daniel. We've done a lot of things
Mm.
together,
Mm-hmm.
and we talk about the continuing bonds thing, which at one time was considered almost kind of pathological because you were supposed to just
Yes.
let go and
Yes.
move on. And this brings us around to the word we talked about before, the D word, before we got
Mm-hmm.
on the air, that I don't typically use. And
Mm-hmm.
I had a grief counselor come over the house after Shayna died, and she said, I know that people are starting to heal when they can start to use that word
Mm-hmm.
because that's when they've accepted the fact that this person has died.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you feel it's important to use that word?
I really feel it's important for parents of young children who don't understand yet what death is.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason, and so for me, when I had a 3.5-year-old, and I was, I was teaching early childhood parent education, so I was kind of aware of this anyway. But then here I was, and I had to tell my daughter that her brother died, and I could barely, I choked on the word.
Mm-hmm.
The reason it's so important is because it's the only word that really accurately tells a child what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Passed away, what does that mean? A child doesn't know what that means, and it
Mm-hmm.
often leaves them feeling like this person can come back. And sometimes adults who aren't comfortable with saying died and dead will even say, one person shared with me that their dad told their child that grandma had gone to the moon.
Mm.
And so, that seems harmless enough, and that seems pretty final. But the child started having ideas of becoming an astronaut so they could go to the moon and see grandma. I mean, there
Yeah.
was no permanence in that. And so if we don't use the correct word, children are either just confused because they don't know really what happened. They don't understand what past means,
Mm-hmm.
or they get the wrong idea. They think, well, if they went away, or if they went to the moon, or whatever else we might say, then they can come back again. And if I just wait long enough, I can see them again. And eventually, of course, the child is going to learn the truth, and they're going to learn that person is never coming back. And that can be like losing the person all over again, because now they understand, oh my gosh, I won't ever see this person again. And it's like death happens at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So the better thing is to tell them died, and then try to help start telling them what died means, and use all the teachable moments we have in a child's life to teach them about grief. And I say childhood is the best time for kids to learn about grief. You can talk about the plant that dies, or they might find a young bird that fell out of a nest and talk to them about the bird having died, or the leaves that are green in the fall and die, green in the spring and die in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many ways to teach children about life cycles and death. And so then the next question is, well, what do we tell them death is? And so we can just say the person's body stopped working.
Mm-hmm.
And we can say, they were very sick, or, in the case of an older person, we can maybe say it differently, but we also want to be careful not to convey to the child that what happened to that person could happen to them. But just sometimes the body stops working, and then they're dead, and they can't hear, and they can't see, they can't talk to us, they can't feel. And we're going to bury them, and we're not going to see them again. And they can learn that and then grow into understanding what death is as they grow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really, and it's funny
Mm-hmm.
because when this counselor came, she was talking to us, and I guess she worked with people that had young children, and they
Yeah,
would use these euphemisms, and they're like, oh, well, if they're asleep, then they can wake up. Um,
exactly.
so I mean that does make sense, and it's interesting because when I still remember her saying this to me. It's been almost 7 years now,
Mm-hmm.
but as I got involved with helping parents heal, because I believe in the importance of language too.
Mm-hmm.
The thing about a person dying is that means that they're no more. I mean, that's the
Right.
typical meaning of the word dead.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that the body dies. Clearly, the body does stop functioning,
Mm-hmm.
and this may be too advanced a concept for a 3-year-old. I don't know, where you say your body stopped functioning, but you still go on. So I'm curious because as we were talking, I was thinking about watching this movie again myself, like
Mm-hmm.
movies like Coco. Have you seen? I'm
Mm-hmm.
assuming you've probably
Mm-hmm.
seen the movie Coco.
Yeah.
So how do you feel that an impact that might have on a child? Is that a good thing or a bad
Oh,
thing?
absolutely. I mean, that goes with your beliefs. And And I come from a Christian perspective, and I believe in that hope that there is an essence of our loved ones. I mean, we're not just this flesh and bone and blood. I mean, we're so much more than that.
Mm-hmm.
And I know what my child's dad used to say, what Deanna's dad used to say, was that David's shell died. And some people refer to the body as the shell. And, we did talk to her about that. And we did say David was still with us,
Okay.
and talked about his presence. And she had a very strong presence and connection with him. They used to play ninjas. And when David was fighting his cancer, he would be a ninja fighting the cancer. And they played ninjas. And after he died, she had her ninja-ness. And she would say that she could see David because she had her ninja-ness, and she could hear him talking to her. And, I mean, I never had the impression that she thought she actually audibly heard him, but that she was living this presence. And there was one time when I was sad about David, and I was kind of crying, and I said, "Oh, I'm so sad that David's not here." And then I said, "I mean that he's not physically here to give me a hug." And she said, "Oh, Mommy, he still hugs me."
We'll get back to Grief to Growth in just a few seconds. Did you know that Brian is an author and a life coach? If you're grieving or know someone who is grieving, his book, Grief to Growth, is a best-selling, easy-to-read book that might help you or someone you know. People work with Brian as a life coach to break through barriers and live their best lives. You can find out more about Brian and what he offers at www.grieftogrowth.com, www.grief2growth.com. If you'd like to support this podcast, visit www.patreon.com/grieftogrowth, www.patreon.com/GRIEF2growth to make a financial contribution. And now, back to Grief to Growth.
And so she had this comfort. And then at some point, as she got a little bit older, I remember her saying to me once that she didn't have her ninja-ness anymore, and she couldn't hear David. She couldn't talk to him anymore. Actually, I think what she first told me was, "He sounds different now, Mommy. He doesn't sound the same." And so, she experienced him, and I believe that we do. How we do, I can't, I'm not really sure, but I believe that his presence is here. I believe his presence was there for her, so yes. And I do think that's important, as long as that meshes with your personal beliefs,
Sure.
but yeah.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting you used the word shell, because when I was a kid, I was terrified of death for a very long time, even as an adult. And my grandmother died when I was I think it was about 12 or 14. Yeah, I think it was about 14. And I never went to funerals, but I went to her funeral, and I walked up to the casket, and I looked at her, and I'm like, "That's not her." It just hit me. It's like, that's not my grandmother. That's the shell. But you can look at a sleeping person and the person's there, right? But I looked at her body, and it was like, that's not her. And I just walked away. I'm like, she's gone. I mean, I believe, I was a Christian at the time, but I believe that, I believe in the soul. But so that's why, and so some people said, well, you're in denial if you don't use the word died. And I know it makes language very awkward sometimes, right? When we say passed away, or they transitioned or stuff like that. But I think for me anyway, it's important to understand, like when I say, like earlier I said, we had Shayna's body cremated. I mean, it's awkward language, but we don't cremate people because people aren't in there. So that's just my own thing about it. But I love your with kids, I think you're right. You have to be straightforward. You've got to use the word, because that is the word. And if we don't use the word, they're going to hear it from somebody else. So we can say, I love you say, so they died, and this is what that means.
Yes. And that's going to grow with them as they get older. They'll understand death more and differently, and there will be more conversations around that, as they start to learn more about people's ideas of what happens when after death and all of that. I mean, those conversations will come later. Yeah.
Well, and the other thing that you said I was really interesting about Deanna and her saying, I see him, I hear him. And I don't know, again, what your beliefs are about that, but I think young kids are still more connected to the other
Oh,
side. And so when they say, I see a sibling or I hear a sibling or grandpa's here, a lot of times we dismiss it. It's play, it's imagination. I think they see them. I
Oh,
think
I do too. I do too, Brian. I think there is this connection. And the other thing that we experienced that kind of goes along with that is David and I used to raise monarch butterflies in the backyard. And we had some milkweed, and we'd go find the little eggs, and we'd, raise them until they were butterflies and release them in the backyard. And he would name them like, Rose and Daisy and names like that. And we had done this for a few years, and my son died in May, and in August of that year that he died, my sister, and it was actually my sister who had sort of gotten us on this thing of raising monarchs, she was playing with Deanna in the backyard, and she called me out there, and a tree in our backyard was full of monarchs. And we had never experienced that before in the years we'd let them go. I mean, we'd never had a colony of them coming in our tree. And it just so happened that I had also found a book called On the Wings of a Butterfly. Do you happen to be familiar with that book?
I'm not familiar with that book, no.
It's a children's book, and it's a book about a girl who got sick and was in the end died. And I don't remember, I almost think maybe she did have cancer, but she had a pet caterpillar. And the cat, while she was feeling sick, the caterpillar started to feel funny, and then it went into a chrysalis. And when she died, the monarch, and it was a monarch, came out of the chrysalis. And in the back of the book, it kind of talks, the author talks about writing the book and says that the Mexicans believe that the monarchs are the souls of their loved ones. And so here's this tree full of monarchs after my son died. And it happened the next year too. And then it hasn't happened since. So, and I'm sure you've heard stories like that. I have heard stories like that from people, with butterflies and cardinals and, other animals. So I believe there's a connection for sure.
Yeah, well, we're in agreement on that. So I want to talk to you about what is the good grief parenting or the good grief parenting approach. Yeah.
The good grief parenting approach is the idea, the recognition that none of us want to encounter grief. Nobody likes grief. It's painful. And when we encounter it, and we've got children who need to be exposed to it, it's, what we just kind of get paralyzed as adults. What do we do? How do we talk to this child? I don't want this to be a part of their life. I don't want to make them sad. I don't want to have this big dark cloud. And so we just really don't like grief. But the truth, and we try to avoid it. There's a lot in our culture about, people don't, especially with child loss, but with other losses as well. People don't want to talk to a griever. They don't want to talk about, the person who died. They want the person who's sad to cheer up and be happy and, learn to enjoy life again. And we just don't want to deal with grief, and we try to avoid it. And I've learned that grief really is something that is part of our healing, that it is a good part of our healing. It's necessary. It's a normal, natural response to loss. And our body responds in ways that it needs to, and ways that help us manage the changes that we go through as a result of grief. So when I talk about good grief, and it's a parenting approach. Good grief parenting is for parents who now have to recover after losing dreams and having a young family and saying the most devastating thing possible has happened to our family. Now, how do we possibly live forward? And it helps them recognize how to parent from a grief-informed framework that helps kids recognize how normal and natural grief is, and how we need to just embrace grief, allow it to do in our lives, impact us, and get assimilated into our lives in the way that it has to, because we can't get rid of it. It's not going to go anywhere. So we can make it a part of our lives that helps us to experience more compassion and just walk in the world maybe in a gentler, kinder way. And we can teach that to children and help children be able to say the word dead, and grow up to be adults who can talk about that and have good lives with bright possibilities, in spite of having experienced something that we never wanted them or us to experience.
Yeah, and as a parent, I still remember the day that Shayna died, and Kayla was coming home, and I'm looking at my 18-year-old daughter, and in addition to dealing with my own grief, even worse than that was thinking she's going to have to go through this for the rest of her life, which is hopefully going to be much longer than my life. And so as parents, we want the best for our kids, and we don't want them to go through that, right?
Right.
So, and if they're not talking about it, I can see how a parent would be very tempted to just say, I'm just going to leave well enough alone. I've got to deal with my own stuff. They seem to be doing okay. They're back in school. They're not talking about it. They're not crying. So we might use that as an excuse.
Right.
Just, kind of check out. And I hear you saying, and I think it's very important, we need to help them process that, because otherwise it's going to come back.
So really, the things that I talk about in good grief parenting, first of all, it is examining our own beliefs about grief, many of which really aren't helpful or healthy. And so I talk about good grief beliefs, which are, these things that help us recognize that going through grief is the way that we heal. And another one of those pieces is that conversation piece, because if we can talk with our kids and help them get comfortable with that conversation, that's going to just open up the whole experience of coping with grief and getting needs met and being honest with one another and getting the support you need and giving the support you need. And so that inclination to shy away from it, conversation is really one of the most healing things that we can do around grief. Talk about our experience, find someone who will listen. Those who try to comfort a griever, need to also recognize there's absolutely nothing you can say that's going to heal that grief. It's just your presence and your compassion and your willingness to listen that are going to, and not forget, that are going to be so very, very helpful. Another thing that I mention in good grief parenting is the essential messages that children need to hear, because when their world is shaken by the loss of another young person, like you say, we want our kids to live a lot longer than we do. We don't expect them to go before us. And so the child also, the sibling that's left, the friends that are left, see their innocence is stolen, that young people can die. Right. And so, and they also examine they see how you feel, and they're wondering, where does this leave me? Often Deanna wondered, would it have been better if I had died instead of David, because they talk so much about David, they miss David so much. So it's also important as a parent to be sure that you are reinforcing those messages of value, those essential messages for your living child. And, I love David. I miss him so much, but I am so glad you are here, because I love you so much. And I'm glad you're still here, um, and just sharing essential messages about how you value that child, how that they can handle this and other hard things that they go through, those messages that encourage them to prevail through this, and let them know that we're going to prevail through this. So that essential messages is a part of it. Continuing bonds is a part of it. I have 4 heartbeats, and they are that, the good grief beliefs, the continuing bonds, the essential messages, and then making the choices to live forward in healthy ways. What do we have to do if we're gonna assimilate grief in healthy ways into our lives? What's that going to look like? What do we have to do? And so that's kind of those, I call them choice actions, just being intentional about how we're going to live forward with our grief. And that's the 4th heartbeat.
Yeah, I think it's so important, because our kids are looking at us to kind of model that for them. And I
Right.
know, as a parent, when you have when you lose a child dies, you know, you're going through your own thing, and you're wondering how you're going to make it. But I think it's really important that you always give hope to your child that you are going to make it, and that they can make
Right.
it too, because it's such a devastating thing, and it's so unfair to that, that child. You said that loss of innocence, the
Yes.
knowing that this can happen. And then, my daughter, I remember it broke my heart when she said, because similar to what Michelle said, or what Deanna said, "Mommy, half of me is gone." She said, "I never wanted to be an only child, and
Yes.
she was the older, so she always looked forward to her sister coming.
Yes.
She was 3 when Shayna was born, so and they were like twin flames. So
Mm-hmm.
she was like, this, I don't know if I can do this. I think
Mm-hmm.
that was kind
Mm-hmm.
of her attitude. So, um, I was going to ask you, do you work with parents, and then they in turn work with children? Do you work with children
Yes.
directly?
No, I work with parents. I work with them on how to parent this child, and
Hmm.
it's a lot of just good, sound parenting. Anything that I offer in my Good Grief Parenting course and my coaching would be really good guidance for any parent. I mean,
Hmm.
essential messages, every child needs those.
Hmm.
And there are any number of reasons why, that may not be kind of front and center for parents to communicate that. And so, but yes, so I support children. My mission really is the child,
Hmm.
but I do it by helping the parent with parenting. And the only way that I can help them with the parenting is to help them with their own grief first. So I start with that self-care piece. And, the very first thing that a parent needs to do and can do to help their child is take care of themselves, make sure they're taking care of their grief and getting the support that they need, and recognizing that as much as your child needs you, your child also needs for you to take care of yourself. So my focus is on parenting to help the child be healthy and happy and whole. And that means that the parent has to be healthy and happy and whole.
Yes, yes, I totally agree 100%. And that's one of the things that when I'm working with clients, I tell one of my big messages is self care. Because so
Mm-hmm.
many times we, especially again as parents, and I work with a lot of women, and especially women, I think they're so used to being the caregivers and not the care
Mm-hmm.
receiver. And the analogy I always use is put your own mask on first. You've
Me
got,
too.
yeah,
Yes.
you got to take care of yourself first.
Mm-hmm.
And your work, I think, is so important, because again, as parents we can be so lost and we don't get great advice as to even how to be a parent, right? I remember when we
Right.
put Kayla in the car to bring her home from the hospital, when she was born, I'm like, where's the owner's manual? How do
Yes.
we do this? And when this happens, it's nice to have someone that's gone through it like yourself, and
Hmm.
who's done these studies and can say, okay, here are the messages your child needs to hear from you, and
Hmm.
here's how your child's grief is different from yours, because it's been my observation too. Children do grieve differently, which doesn't mean they don't grieve, and I think that could be
Yes.
a trap that we could fall into.
Hmm. Hmm. And because they are children, the way that they grieve is also going to change over the years. I mean, the way a
Yeah.
3.5-year-old grieves, and that's the challenge of supporting a grieving child too, is that you can't just deal with their grief at the time of the loss and say, okay, we've got our handle on this, because when they get to be teens and when they get to be young adults, and start families of their own, they're going to have all these different types of grief that we're going to help them through as well. So yeah, it's a lifelong experience and journey.
It is, but it's funny. I heard someone. It's not funny. I heard someone say the other day that the death of a child is a life sentence, and which is
Mm,
it just broke my heart. Such a negative thing.
mm-hmm,
And people will ask me, well, is this grief going to last for the rest of my life? And I'm like, yes and no. It's
mm-hmm,
not going to be the same for the rest of your life. It will change. It will grow with you, and you'll grow with it. And I think you'll be a stronger, better person. But we also don't get over it. We don't just get
right.
over it and put it away. So in that sense, it's always there. But it's not a life sentence in terms of it's a punishment. It can be, and I love that your term "good grief" because
Mm-hmm,
it can be an
mm-hmm,
opportunity if we take it as an opportunity. And
mm-hmm,
I'm it sounds like your daughter Deanna is a fantastic person that's integrated this into her life, and it's made her more resilient, probably more
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
compassionate,
Yes.
because of David's situation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And parents need people, grievers need to recognize that how you move forward. I say live forward, because living forward implies that you're making intentional choices to make the best of being alive. I mean, it's more than moving forward, it's living forward.
Hmm.
And the point is that it is all a choice, and you can choose to have a happy family even after you've lost a child. It's hard, and
Hmm.
it's not instantaneous, and it's not final, in that you can still have I still have my temper tantrum moments, I say, when I just want my son back and I just don't want him to be gone, but they're
Hmm.
short lived and my life is good. And I do see there are gifts in grief if you can look for them and find them and be open to them. And
Hmm.
so yeah, I that is the important thing, that saying that grief doesn't end, it doesn't isn't a negative thing, doesn't have to be a negative thing. It means that you'll assimilate it, and you can get some goodness from it.
Yeah, yeah. It's someone had told me that 6 years ago I would have said you're crazy.
Exactly.
But this is the great thing about, I was saying, I'm part of this organization helping parents heal, and so when I
Yeah.
joined, some of these people were several years out, and I could see how they had integrated into their life and how they had
Mm-hmm.
made it part of their story, and they take their child forward with them. I hate the term moving on because it implies we're leaving our child in the past. I like
Right.
moving forward with our
Mm-hmm.
children.
Mm-hmm.
And so and I believe that I'm going to see my daughter again, so that gives me
Mm-hmm.
hope too. So
Yes.
it's just it's a temporary thing. We're
Mm-hmm.
temporarily separated for whatever reason, and we can choose how we deal with it. And having someone like yourself to be there to help people make these choices is it's such important work. It's
Mm-hmm.
such needed work,
Mm-hmm.
because we, as a society, we have no idea.
Yes.
I hear all the time, aren't you over this yet? And then there's another mother was posting on Facebook a couple days ago that, like, people don't want to mention her daughter's name anymore,
Yes.
and people say, well, I don't want to mention her name because it's going to make you sad. And
Mm-hmm.
all of our friends know we talk about Shayna all the time. We want to talk about Shayna.
Mm-hmm.
I still feel like if I don't include Shayna as part of my family, she's there going, okay, you better bring my name up,
Yes.
because
Yes.
she's still part of the family.
And even when Deanna was 3.5, because that's a time that it's not only about Deanna and how young she is, but all of her peers. And when I would take her to a preschool class or a new teacher, and some of the teachers knew her because they knew her brother, but I would always tell a new teacher when she was young that she had a brother who died and his name's David, and she'll talk about David. We talk about David, and you'll talk about David with her. It's like, this is normal. She's going to talk about him. He's part of our family, just talk about him. And sometimes we find ourselves having to help others learn that. But when you were talking earlier, it did strike me that the reason that people around you, that Shayna is a part of your life with people around you is because you set that standard from the beginning. And we get to do that as the family. We get to do that. If someone is telling us to do something differently, we can say, I appreciate you're trying to help me, but this is what we're doing. And we're good. We don't need for you to tell us a different way to do it. We're good doing it the way we've chosen to do it. And I think grievers need to feel it's totally okay to tell someone what you're saying isn't helpful. I'm doing it this way,
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Well, Michele, tell people how they can reach you, how they can find out more about what you do, just all your contact info.
Yes. Well, I have a good grief guide. I would just like for everyone who's listening to go get it, because it sort of summarizes a lot of what I've talked about today. And it's 4 simple first steps for a caring adult who wants to help a young child who's grieving. And I talk about, I challenge people to look a bit at their beliefs and things that might get in the way. And I also do provide some actual kind of guidance. I always need sound bites about exactly how to have, okay, Michele, it's great to say, talk to the child, but how do I do that? And so I offer some of that. So you can get my Good Grief Guide at my website, which is goodgriefparenting.com. It's just goodgriefparenting.com. And on the first page, right at the top, you can click a button and get that Good Grief Guide. And this will be helpful for you when your child is grieving any loss that they've had. It doesn't have to be the death of a loved one. It could be, moving and not having the bedroom that they loved anymore, or their dog dying, or, divorce, some of those other losses that children experience. And I hope you don't ever need it to help your child with the loss of a sibling or the loss of a parent or a close loved one. But if you do, you'll have it. So I would just recommend going and downloading that. And you can reach me from my website. You can also follow me on Instagram. I try to be active there at Good Grief Parenting. And yes, those are good ways to reach me.
Awesome. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. I think it's so important. And you said something there at the end, and I think we should talk about that also. This is not just about sibling loss. I want to just emphasize that.
Yes.
It could be the loss of a grandmother. So
yes.
sibling loss is more rare, but we're all going to have a grandparent or a dog, or a chameleon in my daughter's case.
Yes. Yes.
So. A gecko. She had geckos.
Yes.
But, I think it's, and grief comes in all forms, and it's going to come to all of us eventually. So all these things, all these techniques are good for us all to learn even before we need them. They'll be even better.
Yes. And those losses your child has are opportunities for them to learn skills sooner rather than later to deal with grief. And we don't want it for them, but use it as an opportunity to help them develop those life skills that are going to serve them so well.
Yeah. Well, Michele, thanks for being here. It's been great meeting you.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate the opportunity. And I also just really appreciate the work that you're doing supporting parents. And there just can't be enough of us out there doing that. So thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me to talk with you today. It was a wonderful conversation.
That's it for another episode of Grief to Growth. I sure hope you got something out of it. Please stay in contact with me by reaching out at www.grieftogrowth.com. That's grief, the number 2, growth.com. Or you can text the word growth to 31996. That's simply text growth, GROWTH, to 31996. Since you're watching this on YouTube, please make sure you're subscribed. So hit the subscribe button and then hit the little bell here, and it'll notify you when I have new content. Always, please share the information if you enjoy it. That helps me to get more views and to get the message out to more people. Thanks a lot and have a wonderful day.